Be seated, everyone. All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. So glad you made it out today. If you were with us last week, you know that this fall we actually launched out in a sermon series called Radical. Can I hear you say Radical? That's right. And I don't know if you're like this, but I know that for me, whenever that word comes to mind, the word radical, kind of all these images come to mind. And the image of a radical, especially when I talk about a person, if that's an adjective to describe a person, a radical is someone who wears like face paint and is like all in and crazy and makes this face like this very intense, kind of crazy, on fire, passionate. That's what I think about when I think of radical. And maybe you're the same. Maybe we think about political radicals, being radical in their politics, being radical kind of in their ideologies. But what's interesting about this word radical that many people might not be aware of is that if you were to look actually at the root of the word radical, radical itself actually comes from the Latin radic, which means root. And so radical then is not this word that's supposed to conjure up just someone who's super passionate and intense, but instead it's someone who, radicalis, forming the root or from the root, gets back to the root of something. Someone who's trying to recapture the root of what we're supposed to be about. Now, last week we talked about this idea, especially that we're going to be exploring throughout the fall, of this idea then, what is a radical when it comes to the Christian faith? Now, some of us, when we hear that word about being a radical Christian, some of us are kind of like, whoa, that's not me. Because I'm not that kind of person, who raises their hand and sings loudly. In fact, I like taking the third to last pew or something. I don't know if that's you. Maybe I just called you out. But nonetheless, a radical, then, is someone who simply goes back to the roots of what this faith was all about. Now, last week, we explored from the book of Acts the story of the early church, the story of believing in the risen Jesus, that this idea, this event that actually happened was not just some fanciful tale, but that it was a reality, that something that truly happened, and this is what we believe, is that Jesus actually resurrected from the grave, and we sit in this room because a group of ordinary people, nothing kind of supernatural about them, but they believed in this supernatural God. This ordinary people started this kind of supernatural movement because they were radical. They were centered on what Christianity was all about, this Jesus person. Now, as we kind of continue into this series today, I thought that we'd actually go way back, even before the early church, in fact, to the Judeo-Christian roots of what we believe as Christians. And why is it different than the stories that emerge around us? Now, specifically, what I wanted to do was take us way back to what Christians believe about our origins as human beings. What in the world do we believe about God who created the universe and everything in it, and us even? And how is it distinct from the other origin stories? Now, here's the thing. If you're a Christian here or if you're not a Christian here, all of us have wrestled with some of these existential questions before. Questions like, what is the purpose of my life? What is the end of my life? What happens after I die? You don't even have to be a religious person to have wrestled with those questions before, or even wrestled with the questions, why am I here? And what was the beginning of mankind? What was that like? Now, here's the thing about origin stories, the stories of Genesis and beginnings. I once read about this guy named Tom Patterson who worked with a lot of different organizations, Fortune 500 companies, as well as smaller organizations. And he developed something called the strat-op process. Some of you, as consultants, maybe do this with different companies that you engage with. You help people think strategically about operations. And in his strat-op process, called the Patterson process, one of the things that he developed was looking at ways that companies can continue to grow and scale for exponential growth. And one of the first exercises that he does when he gathers a team around, especially in this pivotal moment in an organization, is bring people together and he asks the question, tell us about your story, your history, your origins. Now, why is that? It's because origin stories deeply inform the trajectory of where we've been as well as where we're going, as well as the values that have shaped us and have formed us into who we are today. So for instance, Marvel superheroes, we love the origin stories. And the reason why we do is because those origin stories tell us so much about Spider-Man and tell us so much about Bruce Wayne and how this whole bat thing came about. This is what origin stories do to all of us. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, he wrote this tome called Democracy in America in the 19th century. And he was sent by the French to come and study what was this democracy like in America, especially as different nations were checking out this form of government called democracy. Here, Alexis de Tocqueville comes from France. He makes these observations about American society. And in his observations, what's interesting, as he talks about the democracy in America, he's coming as this outsider who's observing, what is this American kind of experiment about? He's got this long section about the treatment of African American slaves. And it's this really eye-opening account of the racial division, the heightened kind of awareness and acrimony that exists amongst races. What's fascinating about, again, the origin stories of our democracy, when people ask about racism and the social divides that exist today and the oppression of colored people, at the end of the day, that's part of this nation's history. And even so that a Frenchman in the 19th century could look back and be writing, oh man, this is going to be a major source of division within its culture. Because origin stories are important. In many ways, they inform how we behave and what we're about today. And so here's what I thought we'd do. I thought we'd actually go way back and look at the Christian origin story. And how is it different? How is it unique? And what does it tell us about who God is and about who we are? Now, before I do that, though, I thought I'd share a couple of origin stories that are different, that were written in a similar time period. First, I thought we'd look at, in the ancient Near East, in Babylon, there's a Babylonian creation myth called Enuma Elish. Can I hear you say Enuma Elish? That's right. Now, this was written probably between 1600 to 1900 BCE. Now, the Enuma Elish was this ancient Near Eastern creation myth. Now, here in this picture, what's depicted is the god Marduk actually is stabbing Tiamat so that Marduk is winning the power of being the chief Mesopotamian deity that all the peoples would be subjugated to. And so there was this belief in this creation myth that there's this war and conflict amongst the gods, and Marduk wins out. And of course, as human beings are created to be subjugated under Marduk and his rule. Now, this is an ancient Near Eastern myth. Many of you, if you studied ancient Near Eastern history, perhaps you've come across the Enuma Elish before. Now, a few centuries later, there's another creation story that I thought we'd look at, and it's a story of Theogony by Hesiod that was written probably in 700 BCE. It's this Greek tale about Theo, gods, and Geni, right, like the beginnings of the gods. Now, what's interesting, and you probably can't see it here, there's this depiction of gods and goddesses who are constantly at war with one another. And if you know anything about Greek mythology, Zeus ends up winning. He's kind of the largest and the most powerful god. But if you notice, there's trampling, there's fighting, there's warfare, there's all sorts of conflict. Because the belief, not only in the Greco-Roman world, not only in the ancient Near East, the belief about the origins of the world and the cosmos and everything in it, the stories tended to have a certain kind of theme, and the theme was often conflict, acrimony, pain, war amongst the gods. Who will win? Who will be subject to whom? Now, what's interesting then is here comes this creation story, the biblical account, which is so different. Check out what it says in Genesis chapter 1. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now this is different than, for instance, the chaos that existed within theogony. Here, there's this formless void, and here God is. Now, theologians call this kind of creation out of nothing, ex nihilo. Let me hear you say ex nihilo. Like, this is who we believe God is. God is outside time and space, and out of nothing, he creates something. And here's where the story comes about. Now, look at how different this is. It says, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, that it was tov, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Then God said, and then there was morning the first day. Now, here's the thing, this idea, and what you'll notice if you read the account in Genesis, it's got this rhythm to it. God creates something the first day, then he calls it good. He creates something the second day, then he calls it good. Then he creates something the third day. Now, some of you might be like, I'm a sophisticated New Yorker. This is like some sort of myth as well, Drew. So, well, here's the thing. If you actually read in the original language, the Hebrew, in the book of Genesis, it's actually written with poetic language. It's actually not meant necessarily to be a historical account. It's meant to have poetry and themes. And so that's why it's got this rhythm to it, the first day, the second day, the third day. Now, what I believe is God created ex nihilo. He created out of nothing, but there's this thematic way that the author in the book of Genesis is trying to present the case of God, this creator, and the way he creates. That's so different than the acrimony that we see. So much so that he continues to say, he creates this, he creates that, and it is good, it is good, it is good. Now check this out. Then God said, fast forward to the sixth day. Look at what happens. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Here's where we finally get to the creation of you and me, of human beings. Here it is. So that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, this is so different. Like, do you see how this is different than the ancient Near Eastern myths? Do you see how this is different than the Greek myths? It's not born out of strife and conflict and subjugation of human beings. In fact, the story that's being told is that each one of us, men and women, created with this divine fingerprint. That we are made in his image, that we bear his resemblance. Now check out what happens here. It says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground. Everything that has a breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food, and it was so. Now check out what God says about this creation. He doesn't say, oh man, I better get over on the other gods. I better get this God in a headlock. I better stab this God so that no one else will rule over human beings. No. What this God does, he saw everything he made. He says, this is dang good. This is very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Now, do you see how different this is? How explosive this kind of story is? There's this God then who's not creating out of strife and trying to get over on people. Instead, there's this God who blesses with love and kindness. So here's the difference. Here, the other creation myths were created out of conflict and acrimony. This is just the way the world is. The reason why there's schisms and racism and sexism and all sorts of exploitation and oppression is because this is how we were made. And yet, here's what the Christian story begins to say. The Christian story, the Judeo-Christian story begins to say, no. You were created out of God's goodness and kindness, and in his image, that each of us then, we bear the divine. Now, do you see how explosive and different this is? Now, here's the thing. So the creation story goes from the first day to the sixth day. Now, check out what happens after the sixth day, because the sixth day, man and women are created in God's image. Now, check out what happens after that. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. Can you imagine? The whole universe is created. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, we call this Sabbath or Shabbat. So here's what happens then. God creates the entire world in these 6 days in this poetic fashion. It's presented to us. Now, on the seventh day, right after he creates man and woman, God says, hey, peace. We're just going to take a break now, and we're going to Sabbath. We're going to rest and chill out. We're just going to We're just going to delight right now. Now, here's the thing. If I were God, and let's say I just created all of that, and the last thing that I created was men and women in my image. I just created them. Right after I create them, this is what I would say. I'd just be like, hey, Adam and Eve, now get to work. There's a lot of garden here. Can you just start make this apple into applesauce? Can you just start building? I've given you all the raw materials you need. You need to get to work. Now, thank God I'm not God. But isn't this fascinating? What God does immediately after he's created Adam and Eve, he says, hey, I want you to rest. I want you to be. I want you to soak. I want you to enjoy. I want you to know that your kid's loved by a good dad. I just want you to chill. And here's what this reveals to us. That in our origin story, in the Christian story that's so distinct, this is what it means. We are created from belovedness, not for belovedness. Now, what do I mean by that? To be created from belovedness, not for belovedness. You see, if God was some sort of slave-driving God who wanted to create you and I so that each of us, we somehow had to earn his love and approval, that would have been part of the story. There's no way he would be taking a Sabbath after he creates us. Instead, he would have driven us and said, hey, you have to earn your keep. If you want to be my son or daughter, you better earn your way. But instead, God doesn't do that. Instead, after he creates man and women, he immediately welcomes them into his rest. So that each of us, as created beings in his image, would know that we're beloved by him. That there's nothing we have to earn to somehow earn his love, but instead, we can simply be and receive his love. Now, that story, the story of our belovedness, the story of our origins then, it's way different than the stories of acrimony and conflict and earning. And the question that I want to ask you and the question that I want to ask me is, what is the story that you're telling yourself? What is the story that I'm telling myself about who I am and who God is? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to these things called scripts, the scripts we tell ourselves, the scripts that we're living and trying to fulfill. What is the story you're trying to fulfill? Is it the story of striving for belovedness, or is it a story of already knowing your belovedness? I know for me, and I've talked about my family and my own family's history before. I grew up with not three and a half brothers. I grew up with three brothers. One of them is my twin brother. We were all born within 3.5 years, though, so very close in age. And my twin brother and I, we were the youngest of four boys. And I've talked about the story of my father and my mom and my dad. I remember, we had a very contentious relationship with my dad. He was just very violent and unavailable. I don't have any positive memories of my father. And neither do my brothers. And so I remember kind of years later talking to my dad about my origin story, our birth. And I remember talking to my dad, and I just said, Dad, what was going through your mind when we were born? Peter and I, my brother and I, my twin brother. And my dad's he goes, when you were born, I cried. And I was so blown away that he had admitted that, because you got to understand, I've never seen my father cry. He just crying is something that he's incapable of crying. That's what I believed about him, because everything I knew about him was rage and was work. And so my dad, when he tells me that he cried, I remember just being kind of this shocking moment, wow, you cried? You cried when we were born? And then my dad goes, yeah, it's because I didn't know how I was going to pay for you. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I got it. And that story, though, I'll never forget it, because that's kind of the story, the script that I had received throughout my life. The script that I'm only worth something. And that I better prove my worth. I better prove to my family that I'm worth being part of the family. I need to show them that I'm worth being loved. And that script is something that's stayed with me for most of my life. This script that tells me that I need to earn people's love. There is nothing free in this world. I better show people. And so the script that continues to drive me from time to time is not a script of living from belovedness. It's to strive for belovedness. And so in this kind of the inertia of my life, in the drive of my life, it's to somehow prove to people that I'm worth existing. What is the script that you tell yourself? Some of us, the scripts that we tell ourselves, the scripts that drive us even in this city, the script to show that, hey, I can make it in this city. Script to show, and your scripts that are so enmeshed with some selfish ambitions and pursuits that you and I carry. And what drives us then is not this sense of rootedness and belovedness. Instead, it's this insatiable drive to somehow prove that we're worthy of something. I was talking to a mentor of mine, and my mentor, we were both talking. We both grew up in these households where the scripts that we were told were stories about how we're losers and we're not going to amount to anything. And so that's why he's my mentor. And anyhow, that script just so lies within me that it's so hard to get out of that. I think that I need to prove myself. And one of the things that we were joking about, and he's in his 60s, one of the things we were joking about was that he still, even in his 60s, as a fairly accomplished person, he still wants to prove that he's not a bum, and that he wants to prove it to all those kids in middle school who thought he was a loser. And have you ever had this experience where, all of us, we've probably had those awkward middle school moments. If you haven't, I hate you. And but we've all been in those moments, the alienating moments, those moments of middle. Have you ever had this moment where you're like, oh man, middle school, I can't wait to get out of middle school. And then you realize in high school, and it feels a lot like that too. There's politics, and there's the cool crowd, and then and then you go off to college, and you're like, oh man, we're more mature than this. And then you go to college, and you're like, man, this feels like middle school. Ever had this? And then you're like, man, I'm going to go to grad school. You go to grad school, and you're like, wow, this feels like middle school. And then you get a job at Google or Facebook, known as having the best kind of environments and work culture. Then you go there and you're like, oh, it kind of feels like middle school. Have you ever been there before? And you're kind of, whatever industry you find yourself in, you realize we're just replaying the same old scripts, the same scripts of alienation, of frustration, of trying to prove ourselves, of trying to feel like we don't, of trying to say oh, I do belong, when I've made up all of these stories inside myself that I don't belong, and that I'm only worthy of something by how much I achieve. And I just came from sabbatical, and I was mentioning last week this idea of sabbatical, of going away, was, for me, it was just kind of this recalibration moment of what is my heart about? And am I truly in tune with the freedom that comes from knowing God? Or am I just simply striving like the rest of us? Now, here's the thing. In my industry as a pastor, there can be so much fraught with my own ambitions and my own kind of verve for wanting to get things done so I can show people, so I can show all those kids in middle school. See what I've become? I've become something. There's something in me that wants to tell my dad, Dad, you see how I proved that your tears when I was born, that I'm somebody now? It's amazing, the drive that comes within me, the insatiable longing to somehow fulfill this script that I'm a nobody, that I'm a loser, and I better prove to everyone that I'm really somebody. And the script that I tell myself doesn't come from the living God. It just comes from my own head. It comes from all the things that I struggle with, from all the insecurities and shame that I carry. When I was talking to my mentor, one of the things that we were doing is he was he was just reflecting with me over everything that's happened at Hope Church over the past 7 years, and he was showering me with praise. He was like, Drew, it's really amazing what God has done in your family. You know, your son, my son David was born 7 years ago, and that was the same year that we started Hope Church. And so we've kind of seen what's happened at Hope, and we've seen it kind of through my son's kind of age as well. And my daughter was born 3 years ago. And so, like, there's, like, these moments where, like, he was just like, Drew, it's amazing what God has done. Like, your wife was in the hospital last year, but, like, she's now perfectly healthy. And, like, there was these moments where he's just basically just like, it's amazing what God's done. And here I am, and I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, me, I'm a loser. No, it's not me. It's all God. And he's like, hey, listen, no. I want you to know, like, God's done something amazing in it. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm a loser. Do you know where I came from? I'm a loser. That's not me. And he's just like, Drew, I just want to celebrate with you. I just want to bless you and say, God has done an amazing work. I'm like, me? Come on. I'm a loser. Just leave me alone, okay? You know, like, it was like this weird, I could not accept a different story. I could not receive a different script. You know, some of us, the scripts that run in our heads, forget what God thinks, forget God's story, we know our own story. And the stories that we tell ourselves, stories about how I'm only worth something if I'm in a relationship with someone. Stories that we tell ourselves, I'm only worth something if I give my body away to someone, even though I don't want to. I'm only worth something if this person will hold me and will love me. Stories we tell ourselves about, I'm only worth something if I get this promotion, if my LinkedIn profile looks a certain way, if my social media feed is filled with likes and with applause. Then I'm worth something. What is the script you tell yourself? What is the script that has overwhelmed your own life and heart? What is the script that you've told yourself about longing for belovedness? And meanwhile, God's like, hey, you got nothing to prove. Hey, you are dearly loved. You're a child of mine. You bear my image. You're very good. Hey. And we're like, God, no, not me. Do you understand what a loser I am? Do you understand that, like I need to prove myself? Do you understand that if I kind of rest on my laurels, then this city will eat me alive? Do you understand how all these other people have it all great, but I've had it this bad, and I now need to prove there's all sorts of scripts that we tell ourselves. And the question is, which script are you listening to? Now, here's the thing, though, about the Christian story. The Christian story, as you know, in the book of Genesis, what happens is God says it's very good. He gives them rest. And from there, it's all downhill. Adam and Eve end up believing a different story, the story that Satan would tell, the story that would lead to shame and self-protectiveness, the story that would lead to strife, the story that would lead to all sorts of brokenness that we experience in the world today. But you know what God's been in the business of? The Christian God. Even though we may have rejected the story of God, you see, there's a story of God who, like a loving father, would continue to whisper to you and to me, you're my beloved son, you're my beloved daughter. You're mine. You bear my image. You are my beloved son. You are my beloved daughter. If you would just turn to me, if you would just stop listening to those damning voices and scripts, and if you would just start listening to the one who's loved you all along. You know, the story of Jesus is a story of God who would come into this world, that even though you and I might have all of these scripts that we're living by, today he wants to rewrite whatever story you're telling about yourself, whatever stories that have haunted you, whatever stories that have informed the drive that leads you to those relationships that you know is not good for you, or that leads you to parent in that way where it's super controlling, or that leads you to essentially pursue your career with such crazy abandon at the own expense of the people that you love. And Jesus would come to tell you, my love is free for you. My love is for you. And there's this moment when Jesus is baptized and these words are spoken over Jesus, and the words are, you are my beloved child. With you I am well pleased. And that is the script I want to offer to you today. The script that tells you that whatever you're worried about, the script that tells you that whatever causes these anxious feelings, the script that tells you whatever causes you to have your life misaligned, and you and I know it, there's not enough vacation days, there's not enough of a salary that can truly bring you the peace that you've always longed for. And here's what God says. God says, you can only find it when you rest in me. When you can begin to believe a new script, the script that tells you, you are my beloved child. You've got nothing to prove to me. You've got nothing to hide from me. You are my beloved child. With you I am well pleased. And if you don't believe it, you can believe that I can send my son to live and die on your behalf, that I would give my life away so that you can be free. That's how deeply committed his love is for you and for me. Can you imagine if we lived with that kind of freedom? Can you imagine if we started to live with new kinds of scripts that informed our lives? Can you imagine how that would change our families and our children? Richard Rohr has this phrase where he says, pain that is not transformed is transferred. Can you imagine if the scripts that began to inform your life began to change, and as a result, it began to change the generations after you? The kind of scripts that believe in a God who is loving and kind and gracious and for us and forgives us and loves us and wants to give us a brand new story today. I'm going to invite you to stand with me. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward. And here's what I want to do. I just want to invite you I just want to pray for us and lead us into this song. I want to speak to anyone today who maybe today you carry some shame. And there's a story you've told yourself. And you just can't stop berating yourself. I want to tell you there's a new story today. A story of a good dad who loves you, who died for you, wants to welcome you home. Pray for anyone who carries some regrets. And those regrets continue to haunt you. I want you to know that today, right now, there's a good Father in heaven whose love is for you and who's got a beautiful destiny for you. I want to speak to anyone today who that misalignment, you realize the things that have driven your life, while some of them have produced all sorts of good, you realize that that main thing has really caused your own heart and soul to be misaligned. Whether you've pursued that relationship, or whether you've pursued that career, whether you've pursued kind of an addiction, whatever it might be, and today you just want to recalibrate before God. You want to say, God, I want to just be a beloved son again, a beloved daughter again. I just want to be free. I want to be free. And I want to live from belovedness, not for it. So that the things that drive my life is not this thirst for whatever it might be, but comes from this well, this deep well of love and joy and peace that comes from knowing that my identity is not found in all of these other places, but from you, the true and living God, really, truly the one whose opinion really matters. So, Father, I pray over this room. God, I pray for new scripts, a new kind of vision for life, a new kind of story, a new kind of origin that changes the way we view you and changes the way we view ourselves. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.